Hello, everyone. This is the 218th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles on the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back English author Mr. Gareth Dace as we discuss his book, Hot Shot Tottenham Spurs in the 80s. Hoddle, Hummel, and Hazards. This book covers Tottenham Hotspur's decade of the 1980s. Mr. Dace is a lifelong Tottenham Hotspur fan. He was previously interviewed on his other book regarding Tottenham in the 90s. Is Gascoigne gonna have a crack? Spurs in the 90s, magic, mayhem, and mediocrity. Welcome back, Gareth.
Thanks very much for having me back on, Sean.
You have already written about Tottenham in the 90s. Was it only natural to write about Tottenham in the 80s?
It was a decade that I was always really intrigued by. It's a decade that, unlike the 90s, I don't have many first-hand memories of, at least not till the back end of the 80s. And I just felt that there was a lot I needed to unpick regarding the 90s and the state that Spurs started in. And the natural way to do that was to go and write a prequel by going back and exploring the whole of the 80s.
Like you said, you somewhat lived through the events of the first book. You would have been very young for most of these events. As a result, how was the writing different this time?
So it relied a lot more on research. It relied a lot more on anecdotes and interviews that I could get with people. I was aware of all the key events. I mean, as you say, I was born in 1981, so technically I was alive and lived through Ricky Villier's heroics in the 1981 FA Cup final, but I was, literally 4 months
Mhm.
old. So I think I've always been aware as a big Spurs fan of all those key moments of Ozzy's dream, of the 1984 UEFA Cup win, of David Pleat's team from 86, 87, Clive Allen's 49 goals, the enigmatic qualities of Glenn Hoddle. But I'd never really been able to piece all those things together. So yeah, I was very reliant on research. I was pleasingly really happy with the amount of footage that was available on YouTube, which made a big difference. So there was actually more footage of the early 80s than I thought there was. That, maybe for some of those seasons, at least half of the games you could find coverage of, which allows you to, it puts pictures on top of some of the words and the facts that you're looking to try and find out, which was really helpful.
Let's go back in time. What was the status of Tottenham in the English football landscape as we come to the decade of the 1980s, where your book picks up from in the 1979-80 season?
I think Spurs were still a quote unquote big club, but they'd suffered the ignominy of having been relegated in 1977. So that was the first time since the 50s that Spurs hadn't played in the first division, which was, well, Manchester United had suffered the same fate a few years earlier. So these things did happen, but Spurs as a big club had really been on the decline as the 70s went through and yeah, suffered the ignominy of playing in the second division for one season, came straight back up. And it was in that summer when they did come back up in 78 that they signed Ricky Villier and perhaps more famously Ozzy Ardiles, which was a huge coup for Spurs to sign these two players, particularly Ardiles, who'd been a big part of Argentina's World Cup winning squad in the summer of 78. So Spurs were on the rebuild. They had these two incredibly exotic Argentinian players in midfield alongside Glenn Hoddle, who was establishing himself as a really high quality technical midfielder. You still had Steve Perryman, who was by then established as the captain and would go on to become Spurs' most caps is the wrong word, but player who played for Spurs on more occasions than anyone else. So you had the nucleus of the side that was going to become, but yeah, their first season back in, which is the season before I start writing about the club, 78, 79 was a tough season. They suffered a couple of very, very heavy defeats to Liverpool and to Arsenal. So they were also ranked, they were no more than a mid-table side based on the number of points that they were racking up. But you felt that there was something there that Keith Birkinshaw as manager may be able to tap into.
Keith Birkinshaw had been appointed in 1976. How had his stewardship of the club been in this time as we come to this new decade?
Well, I think it's remarkable looking at it through the prism of football as we understand it now in the mid 2020s that a manager of a team that gets relegated, let alone a big
Yeah.
club like Tottenham, could get relegated.
That was astonishing.
Yeah,
When I look back myself, I was like, yeah, how is that possible? But
yeah. I think it's very difficult for us looking at it retrospectively to think that that was allowed to happen. If you think about, Angie's fate last season in losing his job despite winning the Europa League. But I don't think it was maybe such a big deal at the time. I think that the directors, for all their faults at the time in the 70s, had a lot of faith in Keith Birkinshaw. And I suppose the fact that he got them up so quickly literally within that first season bought him that time and that credibility, and it provided some vindication actually for keeping him. But he inherited a mess, so Spurs didn't get relegated because of Keith Birkinshaw. They got relegated because the club had been mismanaged, that the directors allowed Pat Jennings to leave and to go to Arsenal of all places. A couple of years before Spurs went down, they didn't replace him with quality. So you had this, you had Glenn Hoddle coming through, but there wasn't really the infrastructure around him. And Spurs had been a declining force. But yes, Keith Birkinshaw was allowed to carry on. From what I gathered, there was some fan unrest. Again, an era before social media, before 24-hour of rolling sports news. So it was far quieter. He was allowed just to get on with it. There you go. You have what turns out to be Spurs' second most successful manager of all time coming through and leading this Spurs team into the early 80s.
and you already mentioned him a few times. Glenn Hoddle was the jewel in the crown at Tottenham.
Mhm.
What was his status at this point, and what was the general backbone of the team?
Hoddle comes through. He made his debut as a 17-year-old in, I want to say 76. I'm guessing slightly because it was just before the period I started writing about. On one of his first games, he scored this incredible goal against England's goalkeeper, Peter Shilton, away at Stoke. It was a driven left-footed shot from range through a crowd of players on his quote weaker left foot. But Glenn Hoddle really is a generational talent there. He was so gifted, incredible ability with the ball at his feet to pick out a pass, and the vision that he had, which also enabled him to score some wonderful goals, which I was able to write about and to research during the 80s. But as his status is coming through, there's, I think, in the written press, there's some skepticism about him because at the time English football was about hard midfield men playing in a fairly rigid 4-4-2, and there was always this concern that Hoddle was too much of a quote luxury player to fit into that system. But Spurs fans, who have always been good at recognising a really talented, technically gifted player, really took to him very quickly. And as you said, you're absolutely right to use the phrase "jewel in the crown," and that's exactly what he was. And then when you start piecing him together with Ardiles and Villa, who were players that were actually on his wavelength, this is where he really started to come into his own. As for the rest of the team, the goalkeeper issue was a problem because they'd never replaced Pat Jennings. Barry Daines, who was a great club servant, was never at Pat Jennings' level, so you had an issue in goal. I think they found that the centre forwards that they had, so Jerry Armstrong, Chris Jones, John Duncan, they'd all been fairly proficient in the second division, but it became quite clear that they weren't going to score many goals in the first division. You've got Steve Perryman, who became the heartbeat of the team, who could play in a number of different positions behind him. But other than that, there just wasn't the quality in the team. But what you did start to see was a crop of really outstanding young players starting to get integrated into the team as the 70s becomes the 80s.
For the 1980-81 season, you have the significant arrival of Scottish striker Steve Archibald from Aberdeen. Also, Garth Crooks, another striker, comes from Stoke City. And in defense, Graham Roberts arrived from Weymouth. But you have the departures of Jerry Armstrong that you mentioned, who went to Watford, among others. And also later in the season, the Irishman Jimmy Holmes also leaves to join Vancouver Whitecaps. This is the season of that famous 1981 FA Cup with that famous Ricky Villa goal in the replay. Did this set the tone for Tottenham for this decade?
Think so, and probably beyond that as well. It's a real coming of age moment for the team who, didn't play particularly well in the league that season. Maybe they finished eighth or 10th, but it was certainly no higher than mid-table. And you had the culmination really of this team that was coming together. So I think summer 1980 or the back end of the 79-80 season, it's really clear that Spurs assets are in midfield. So, again, Hoddle, Ardiles, Villa, playing in a completely different style to pretty much every midfield in the country. But what they didn't have, just didn't have the strikers in front of them that could score goals. So, talking to really all Spurs fans about that era who remember it, they'll say they realised what Spurs needed. They needed two strikers who could score goals, and they needed some central defenders as well who could tighten things up at the back. So that double signing of Archibald and Crook, so two players who'd never played with each other before. It's a bit of a gamble to buy one centre forward. You never really know how they're going to adapt. Steve Archibald had scored lots of goals for Aberdeen in a side that had shocked British football by winning the league title that year ahead of Rangers or Celtic, which happens is very, very rarely. Crooks was a powerful striker. He'd been in England under 21 set up. He'd played against Archibald, but of course they'd never played together. So you put them both together and they hit it off in terms of matches absolutely instantly. But yeah, I think there's a really good story about how in their first few training sessions and during pre-season, they both got incredibly frustrated because on the training ground, Hoddle, Ardiles and Villa would pass the ball amongst themselves, wouldn't release the ball going forwards. And both Crooks and Archibald were making these runs. And, I had to turn around to Keith Birkinshaw and say, why aren't they passing to us? And that's because Hoddle, Villa and Ardiles had just been used to holding on to the ball because there was no point passing it forward to the strikers. They weren't going to do anything with it. So once Archibald and Crooks won the trust of those three magnificent midfield players, suddenly it was a different ball game, and Spurs could stretch defenders, long and wide, and then by doing that, that allowed more space for Hoddle and Ardiles to operate in. Then in defence, you mentioned Graham Roberts signing from Weymouth, who are a non-league side, so they go put that through the prism of modern football today. A team that is an aspiring team at the top of the first division that wants to win trophies goes and buys a player from effectively the fifth or sixth division, and Roberts slotted in. He came in midfield initially, but he and Paul Miller formed a really combative central defensive partnership with Steve Perriman playing at right back and Chris Hughton, who was one of the real finds from the youth team, going in and playing left back, and Tony Galvin, another player Spurs signed from non-league, played on the left side of midfield and provided an incredible balance. So you've got these component parts really from the incredibly technically gifted midfield trio of these two new bought strikers who came in and instantly started scoring goals and formed a partnership. And then in defence, you've just got this team that eventually just clicked, albeit really only in the cup competitions because the league performances that season were nothing really to write home about.
And that Ricardo Villa goal is gonna always be referenced as one of the greatest FA Cup goals, if not the best FA Cup goal. Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course it will. It turned out to be the winning goal. Great story for Ricky Villa, who'd played in the first game on the Saturday game that Spurs were very fortunate to get away with and to equalise and to get that replay. And Villa, infamously was substituted midway through the second half and was so disconsolate at his performance and the way that the game was going, had just trudged off round the side of the pitch and walked straight back to the dressing room, which upset a lot of the players at the time and the supporters when he walked past them. And Keith Birkinshaw was very, very clear straight after the game that he was going to pick him for the replay despite that. And then it was that that real rags to riches moment where he goes on to score one of the most iconic FA Cup final goals, ultimately to win the game for Spurs.
For the 1981-82 season, you have the departure of the defender Don McAllister. He joined Charlton. As far as the arrival, you have Liverpool's veteran goalkeeper Ray Clemens coming aboard, as well as Welsh defender Paul Price, who came from Luton. This season, Tottenham is back in Europe, and they would reach the quarterfinals of the Cup Winners' Cup before being eliminated by Barcelona. In the league, there's improvement as the team finished fourth, so they had built up on the 1981 FA Cup win. Also, in the League Cup, Tottenham reached the final but lost to league champions Liverpool. But most importantly, Tottenham won its second successive FA Cup, again in a replay against Terry Venable's
Mm.
Queen's Park Rangers side. Were Tottenham at this point looked upon as a team that's going places?
Yeah, absolutely. So you got to remember, winning the FA Cup was really significant. The FA Cup final was, winning the FA Cup was probably bigger than winning the league back then. It was the occasion. It was the game that was broadcast around the world. It's how you really grew your profile by winning the FA Cup. 81, 82, going into about March time. Spurs could have won all four trophies that they were in that year. They managed to compete on four, across four different competitions, played 66 games that season, and just fell away in the league in the end. And it was that combination of all of those games that they played that ultimately was their downfall. You mentioned that they played Liverpool in the 82 League Cup final, took the lead in that game. Again, this was the great Liverpool side that was perennial league champions around the early to mid 80s. Liverpool and equalised with a couple of minutes to go. Lots of Spurs fans that I spoke to will mention the challenge that Graham Souness put on Tony Galvin quite early on that absolutely would be a red card, that you wouldn't even have to go to VAR now. And he got away without even a free kick being given against him with the game 1-0 up at the time. Similar-ish story in the European Cup Winners' Cup, which is Spurs got to the quarterfinals. Many Spurs fans that I've spoken to who remember that game do not have the same memories or thoughts about Barcelona as maybe you or I do, who remember tiki-taki Barcelona and the sides of Xavi, Iniesta, and
Yeah,
Messi.
nothing of the
This
like at this point.
no,
Yeah.
this Barcelona team are an absolute bunch of animals who kick Spurs off the pitch and in the first game at White Hart Lane, and then very, very narrowly on the second leg. I know Barcelona won the first game at Tottenham, and then it was 1-1 in the new camp. So Spurs were knocked out. It was a really good learning experience. It would serve Spurs well a couple of years down the line. But they limped home in the FA Cup. It's fair to say that game against QPR. It was an incredibly tired performance. QPR were in the second division, and then it took a replay and it took a Glenn Hoddle penalty to put that to bed for Spurs to secure FA Cup wins back to back. They were the first team since the Spurs team in the early 60s had to win the FA Cup in successive years.
For the 1982-83 season, in the spring of 82, you have the Falklands War. So,
Mm.
as a result, Osvaldo Ardiles was loaned in the first half of the season that year to Paris Saint-Germain. As far as arrivals, you have the very important arrival of Gary Mabbutt, a defender coming from Bristol Rovers, who would serve the club nearly until the millennium. And later in the season, you have the arrival of the Scottish striker Alan Brazil from Ipswich
Mm.
Town. This is a significant season due to the arrival of Irving Scholar as chairman of Tottenham. The team were not as impressive in the cup runs in that season, as well as in Europe, where they were eliminated by Bayern Munich. But in the league, Tottenham maintained its position by finishing four. Was that more important?
Well, as it turned out, yeah, it was really important that they finished fourth that year and therefore qualified for the UEFA Cup the following season. You mentioned Alan Brazil as a striker who, won't go down as one of the great Spurs strikers. He won't even go down to one of the great Spurs strikers in the 80s. They'd signed it a bit of a busted flush. He'd scored a lot of goals at Ipswich and been part of their team that won the UEFA Cup in 1981. He was a Scottish international. He came in and the goals that he scored were incredibly important because the goals that he scored enabled Spurs, to put a run of results together at the back end of that season and just about get over the line to get into the UEFA Cup for the following season, which is we'll go on to talk about, creates the next iconic moment in Spurs history.
What can you say about the arrival of Irving Scholar and the
Mm.
changes that came with it initially?
Yeah, of course. So Irving Scholar's arrival as chairman sets the tone. Irving Scholar's a fascinating character, Sean. He was someone that I was really, really keen to learn a little bit more about because he leaves the club in very acrimonious circumstances in 1991, which I was aware of and briefly cover within the book. And I think Hot Shot Tottenham as a book really lends itself to a narration of Irving Scholar's innovation and ultimately flaws as Spurs chairman. So he is an absolute Spurs obsessive, first of all. And I think that's really important to point out that he, as a kid, was taken to White Hart Lane for the first time when he was 6 years old to watch the great 1950s Spurs team. He had continued to be an obsessive Spurs fan, a season ticket holder, but his business interests, which saw him making a lot of money during the 70s in real estate, saw him moving out to Monaco. But he was, I think, really concerned by the financial position put forward by the current chairman and board in the 80s when they were refinancing to rebuild the West Stand at Spurs. And as someone who understood real estate and property and had that passion for Spurs, just hatched a plan. I won't go into too much detail now, but just hatched a plan for how he could take over the club. And he eventually realised that ambition at the back end of 1982, where he managed to accumulate enough shares and votes that he could vote out the previous board and became chairman. And one of the first things that he did, one of the first initiatives he did, which was really, really radical, was to float the club on the stock exchange. So Spurs were now a public listed company. They had to set up as a PLC, so it became Tottenham Hotspur PLC, and Tottenham Hotspur Football Club became a subsidiary of that, which is really significant. They float on the stock exchange the following season, but he had already started to develop these new ideas for how the club could make money away from the football pitch. He had visions for not just for Tottenham Hotspur, he had very, very high ambitions for Spurs. He ultimately wanted them to return to what he felt was their rightful place as the top club in England, a club that was synonymous with style, with innovation, with bringing the best players and the most stylish players to the club, playing stylish football and ultimately winning. But he had ideas for English football as well. He was really concerned with the state of English football. Hooliganism was absolutely rife in 1982. Attendances were starting to drop. The television really didn't have a great interest in football as the 80s developed. And as it would pan out, Scholar had lots of, I think, really good ideas that we still see the effects of today.
For the 1983-84 season, you have a number of departures. Ricardo Villa leaves and joins the North American Soccer League. A defender, John Lacey, joins Crystal Palace. Much against his wishes, Terry Gibson, the striker, is offloaded to Coventry. And later in the season, the Welsh defender Paul Price also leaves and joins Minnesota Strikers. As far as the arrivals, you have the defensive duo of Danny Thomas from Coventry and Gary Andrew Stevens, not to be confused with Gary Michael Stevens of Everton. Gary Andrew Stevens joins from Brighton, who had just lost in the FA Cup final but were relegated. So Tottenham were somewhat disappointing in the league. They finished eighth, but were impressive in Europe and eliminated Bayern Munich along the way and won the UEFA Cup that season, defeating the holders Anderlecht in the final. We also should mention that they also defeated Johan Cruyff's Feyenoord along the way. So it was a memorable European Cup run. Was this the zenith of the club in the decade due to this trophy? And as a result, was a league challenge seen a realistic aim afterwards?
Well, it was the league championship. That was the next natural step for the team to take. But yeah, that 1984 UEFA Cup run, it's so iconic, and everyone that I've spoken to still talks about that night for the second leg. So the UEFA Cup final was based over two legs. So you played at home and away. The second leg was at White Hart Lane, and I think it's just the most electric atmosphere that most people I've spoken to have ever been at. I think the 81 Cup final replay for those that were there is also up there. That was I think there was a real sense of relief of them winning the FA Cup in 81 because Spurs had gone, 8 years without winning anything, whereas in 84 Spurs were perennial cup winners. But yeah, there was a real glamour to European football and the UEFA Cup in particular. And I'm sure you would have covered this with some of the other authors that you've spoken about, Sean. But the UEFA Cup was in some ways as big as the European Cup or the Champions League as we now know it, because the European Cup was just for the league champions. And as you know, following season, the domestic European champions aren't necessarily still the best teams in their domestic competitions. But the UEFA Cup, which would have been for teams who finished second, third, fourth, and potentially fifth going in there, there's a really strong pool of teams in there. And Anderlecht, as proven by the fact they'd won it the season before that, were one of the strongest teams in Europe. You've mentioned in that cup run that they'd beaten Feyenoord. That was Johan Cruyff's Feyenoord. There was a
And
young
Ruud
Ruud Gullit.
Gullit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a young Ruud Gullit in that side. And that night was, again, many people will say that was Glenn Hoddle's best ever performance. Spurs absolutely blitzed final. That, Cruyff had been quite dismissive of Hoddle in the build up to the game, but Hoddle, that first 45 minutes, he got 4 assists. Spurs were 4-0 up, and Hoddle was running the show. The experiences that Spurs had gained in Europe over the last couple of years, which they hadn't won, they hadn't got beyond the quarter-final stage. Talking to some of the players, they just said how valuable those experiences were, and that they learned from the failures or the setbacks that they'd had in 81, 82 and 82, 83, that they were able to put all those things right. And you get this incredibly tense second leg final against Anderlecht where the stakes are so high. Spurs equalised fairly late in the 90 minutes. Graham Roberts, his greatest moment as a Spurs player and as captain, scores the equaliser, which takes it to extra time, and then to the incredible penalty shootout scene. And penalty shootouts were things that definitely Spurs fans and mostly English fans of English clubs weren't aware of at the time. I think as English fans, we're all scarred by what happened at World Cup in 1990 and in Euro 96. But of course, take that forward 6 years and you just haven't got those, scars at that point. And Tony Parks, who is essentially our backup goalkeeper, a youth team goalkeeper who'd come in for Ray Clements, who'd been injured. And then Keith Birkinshaw stuck with Parks, allowed him to keep his place despite the fact that Clements was back again. And Tony Parks, who I interviewed in the book, is the very, very unlikely hero who makes a couple of saves in that shootout.
Can you discuss the circumstances that led to the end of Birkinshaw's time at Spurs and his clashes with Archibald and Scholar?
Birkinshaw is, the best phrase to discuss Keith Birkinshaw is he was old school, even by early 80s standards. It was a time when the manager was in control of the whole club, would have been in charge of tactics, of transfers, probably lots of peripheral things. Clubs would have been much smaller. You're probably talking about a full-time staff roster of maybe 40 or 50, of which half of those would be first team players and staff involved with the first team. Irving Scholar, as discussed, had totally radical ideas for the way that he wanted football clubs to operate in. They'd listed on the stock exchange, which meant that they were responsible to shareholders. The company had insisted that they would make profits of £900,000 in the first financial year. What's the best way of a company making profits? It's by either generating more income or it's reducing its expenditure. Irving Scholar was as a huge Spurs fan, he was the proverbial kid in the sweet shop. And he wanted to go down. He wanted to be in the changing room before the games, whereas directors and chairmen before that were very, very distant characters. So suddenly Keith Birkinshaw, who just expected to have full control over the club, suddenly has his chairman in his ear saying, "Why are you picking this player?" or "We should be signing this player." So there was always going to be a clash between them. And that reached its head during that 84 Cup run when Spurs played an away game in Vienna, which I think was the quarter-final. That's when Irving Scholar and Paul Bobroff, who was his, the other leading shareholder in the club, had the conversation with Keith Birkinshaw before the game, and they decided between them at that point, I think somewhat reluctantly, that Birkinshaw was going to step away at the end of the season. It became well known. The news was released in one of the London Evening Standard papers in early April, and the club had to make an announcement.
Also, reading your book, I learned that Scholar's method kind of rubbed many people the wrong way, especially Steve Perriman, who apparently there had been this policy of European bonuses to be paid to the players that had been in place since like the 70s.
That's
And
right.
somehow Scholar wanted to do away with it, but Perriman had to convince him to keep it in place, I think. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
that's right. It was quite an unsavory episode. As you said, the players, when Bill Nicholson was the manager, Bill Nicholson's now the club president in 1984. And Bill Nicholson, as manager, had inserted a clause into the players' contracts that if the club made money or generated money through European Cup runs, which of course is additional matches, it's additional gate receipts in the main, then the players should benefit from that. And Steve Perriman, as the captain and player rep, had been alerted to the fact that they hadn't received their bonuses, having got to the latter stages of the European competition. And when he confronted Scholar, according to Scholar in Scholar's book, it wasn't he, it was Paul Bobroff who had pulled those bonuses. And it was quite a heated argument, with Perriman effectively threatening to take the players on strike unless that was reversed, which eventually it was. But it was again, it's another example of, well, how do you save money? How do you generate, profit for your shareholders? Well, you reduce your expenditure, and this is one thing that, according to Scholar, something that Paul Bobroff had insisted on. And Keith Birkinshaw was caught in the middle of this. He was really in the crossfire. So you can understand why he's feeling particularly alienated and put out by the way that the club was now being run.
So for the 1984-85 season, I mentioned that Archibald had a clash with Birkinshaw. He would leave the club. You also had Alan Brazil leaving the club and joining Manchester United. As far as arrivals, you have John Chidozie, the Nigerian striker coming from Notts County, but more importantly, Clive Allen, a striker from Queen's Park Rangers, joining the team. Despite the loss of Keith Birkinshaw, who was replaced by Peter Shreve, Tottenham mounted its most serious league challenge of the decade and were the only team to really challenge Everton, though in the end they finished third. In Europe, the Spurs were eliminated by Real Madrid in the quarterfinals of the UEFA Cup. How is this campaign regarded historically?
It's regarded as the what if season. This was the year that Spurs could have gone on and got that elusive league title that they hadn't secured since 1961. They started the season really well. So Everton, who were also a coming force, I think the relationship and the dynamic between Spurs and Everton is actually really interesting as the 80s progresses. But Spurs went up there. They stuffed them on the opening day of the season. They won 4-1. By Christmas, Spurs were top of the league. I think they won at Norwich just before Christmas to go top. And suddenly there's this sort of sense amongst the fan base that we could actually go and win the league this year. We may just be better. We may be consistent enough that we can go on and we can finally win the league title. And it goes into March, and this was one thing again I was aware of, but just was really keen to find out more about. Spurs had famously or infamously not won at Anfield since the Titanic had gone down. So since 1912, Spurs hadn't won a game away at Liverpool. They weren't always in the top division, and it wasn't until really the 60s that Liverpool established themselves as the force that they were. But Spurs just couldn't win a game there. They had got beat 7-0 there at the back end of the 70s, so there were some pretty big defeats as well. And they went into this game at Anfield with a real sense of belief that this might be the year that they could go there. And they did go and win 1-0. I mean, ironically, it was also the same calendar year that the Titanic's wreckage was discovered at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It was the same year that Spurs won up there. And that meant that with 13 games to go, Spurs were, I think they were maybe a point behind Everton, but they had 9 of their remaining 13 games were at home, one of which was against Everton. So there you go. Finally, they've ended this Anfield hoodoo. And the odds are nominally in Spurs' favour at this point. And there was a real expectation now that they would actually go on and win the league title. But alas, it wasn't to be. They lost a home game against Aston Villa when they had a few injuries, but they just one of those off days. And then they had this crucial home tie against Everton. And this was seen as a league title showdown. And Everton, who were, well, as the league table proved, they were the best and the most consistent team that year, but they won 2-1. But the big moment in that game was Spurs, having clawed the game back to 2-1, were pushing and pushing for an equaliser. And Mark Falco, Spurs striker, puts in this bullet header from pretty much point blank range. And Everton's goalkeeper, Neville Southall, made a save, which anyone I've heard stories for years from people who are at that game, and they talk about this Neville Southall reflex save. There is footage of it. It doesn't really do justice to it. From people who were there, just talk about the sheer physicality of that save and the surge of the Spurs fans in the on the shelf in the East End in anticipation that it was going to hit the back of the net, and the disbelief that it hadn't and it had been saved. So Everton held on to win 2-1 and would then go on to win the league title. And Spurs' form until the end of the season wasn't great. Actually, as you said, they actually ended up finishing third with Liverpool coming in and coming second. And looking back on it now, even with the Pochettino side of 2016-17 that got 86 points, this 84-85 was the year when really that was Spurs' destiny was in their own hands at that point. It was a really good side, and perhaps it could and should have gone on to have won the league title, and that would have rewritten history.
And I was surprised to learn that Mario Kempes was even
Mm,
given a trial in the beginning of the season, but
yeah.
that didn't work out. And in a sliding doors moment, Sir Alex Ferguson was actually offered the job, but he turned it down. So, what might have been?
Absolutely, yeah.
At the end of that season, the Heysel ban robbed the club of European participation for the rest of the decade. How did this new reality hit the club?
It was a really big thing that playing in Europe was a highly prestigious. It put your name on the map, particularly when Spurs did your winning trophies. Everton won the Cup Winners' Cup in '85. They were deprived of playing in Europe. So it's not just Spurs. There's a number of clubs, perhaps more smaller clubs like Oxford United, like Coventry City, at Spurs' expense, Wimbledon, Norwich, who were all denied the opportunity, Southampton were all denied the opportunity of playing in Europe throughout the back part of the '80s. But I think for Spurs in particular, who were so synonymous with those glory nights at White Hart Lane under the lights of winning trophies, and yeah, for 5 years they were just denied that opportunity, which from a prestige perspective and financial perspective had a big impact. It was a period where you started seeing the best English players going out and playing abroad. So Gary Lineker would go out to play for Barcelona before coming back to Spurs. Glenn Hoddle always had his it was always his dream to go and play on the continent. You had a number of players actually going and playing for Glasgow Rangers rather than staying in English football because that's where they could access European football, which was still the highest level of club football. So Spurs are hugely impacted for a number of different reasons.
For the 1985-86 season, you have the departures of Garth Crooks, who joined West Bromwich Albion, Mickey Hazard joined Chelsea. Later in the season, club stalwart Steve Perriman joins Oxford United, ending an association started since 1969. But you have the important arrival of Chris Waddle from
Mhm.
Newcastle. Paul Allen arrived from West Ham. And later in the season, you have Pat Jennings returning to the club, although I don't think he made any appearances, but I guess he was getting ready for the World Cup for Northern Ireland, so he got
Yeah.
some much needed, I guess, practice. Also, Morten Olsen, the Danish defender, almost joined the club before turning the offer down for I learned by reading your book it was because his dogs would need to be
Yeah.
quarantined for 6 months. Is that customary for England if you bring pets? Is that what the
Certainly
situation
was
is?
then. Yeah, it may
Yeah.
be relaxed a little bit now, but yeah, Morten Olsen, who played against Spurs for Anderlecht, and he would have changed the way that Spurs played. He was obviously technically very, very good player. Probably would have played as a sweeper for Spurs, which would have been a slightly different formation and style of play. But yeah, as you say, when he learned that his dogs would have to be quarantined for 6 months, that kiboshed the deal, and it didn't happen.
Well, in any case, that 1985-86 season would be a disappointing one as the team finished 10th and this cost Shreve his job. Was it in every way a season to forget?
Yeah, it was one of those seasons I was really keen to explore. It's one of those seasons that aren't really talked about, and there's probably, if you read the chapter, there's the narrative is more about what's happening off the pitch than what's happening on it that season. So yeah, it was an underwhelming season, having come so close to winning a league title the following year, and then added the quality of Chris Waddle and Paul Allen, who certainly by the end of the season has become really, really key players and would continue to be really key players for the rest of the '80s. It felt, yeah, very underwhelming. It ultimately cost Peter Shreve his job. I suspect Irving Scholar had always wanted to make a more high-profile appointment than that in the first instance. As you mentioned, he came very close to getting Alex Ferguson in 1984. So it was an end of days feel towards the end of that '85-'86 season. But the highlight for many Spurs fans will be the fact that they got to see Diego Maradona play in a Spurs shirt at White Hart Lane in Ozzy Ardiles testimonial. And that's probably the most high profile game that took place at White Hart Lane that season.
For the 1986-87 season, David Pleat is appointed as the new manager. You have the departure of Mark Falco, the striker who joins Watford. Later in the season, Graham Roberts, who had a difficult relationship with Pleat, he joins Graham Souness at Rangers, and that also would not end well for him. And later, Paul Miller would join Charlton Athletic. As far as arrivals, you have Neil Ruddock, the defender coming from Millwall, Mitchell Thomas, another defender, arrived from Luton. You have the Belgian striker Nico Clayson arriving from Standard Liège. And later in the season, England national team midfielder Steve Hodge arrived from Aston Villa. Now, this is the season where Clive Allen had one of those once in a lifetime seasons, and he scored nearly 50 goals in all competitions as the team finished third. The team were favored to win the FA Cup final against Coventry, but surprisingly lost 3-2. Was this an opportunity missed?
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, this season, 86, 87, there is a book written about it, which I use quite heavily for research. In fact, I named the chapter of this, my book, after it, which is Fantastic Disappointment. It was a really bittersweet season for any Spurs fans that it was one of the most entertaining Spurs teams of all time. They played with this really innovative formation of playing five in midfield, which didn't clog it up. It gave Hoddle the freedom, it gave Waddle the freedom, supplied by Ozzy Ardiles, and then you had Steve Hodge and Paul Allen who just knitted everything together, and that provided the environment for Clive Allen to go and score 49 goals that season. Perhaps a bit like the 84-85 season, there was an opportunity to win the league title. Everton again were victorious with that, but it was the cup competitions that Spurs looked like they were going to do well in, and in heartbreaking manner they were beaten by Arsenal in the League Cup semi-final in a replay. And then in the FA Cup, yeah, one of the great FA Cup finals of all time, which Spurs are on the wrong end of, that Coventry, very much the underdogs, just had their day and beat Spurs fairly and squarely on the day. They beat us 3-2. That proved to be the beginning of the end for David Pleat's time. But so many Spurs fans who remember that look back so affectionately now, although so many of them are also really, really scarred. And we have this horrible word that I'm sure you're aware of called Spursy, which is the concept that you managed to pluck defeat out the jaws of victory. And going into the back end of that 86-87 season, it was almost unfeasible that Spurs wouldn't win anything. But to have been 1-0 up and 2-1 up against Coventry in the cup final, to have got beaten 3-2 on the day, is one that still Spurs fans are scarred by now.
And I should have mentioned another significant arrival that season was Scottish defender Richard Gough from
Yeah.
Dundee United. Now, in the summer of 1987, Glenn Hoddle left to join Monaco in France, managed by a certain Arsène Wenger. How big of a loss was this regarded at the time?
I mean, it was huge. Hoddle was a generational talent. He had been the conductor, really, of the orchestra, as Steve Perryman described him for over 10 years in Spurs midfield. That everything that was good about Spurs largely came through Hoddle. His send off was an incredible goal that he scored against Oxford. It wasn't his last game at White Hart Lane, it was his penultimate game. It's quite a famous game, a goal that he picks the ball up on the halfway line with Spurs having defended a corner. He pirouettes and twirls through two Oxford defenders, then puts the goalkeeper on his backside and rolls it into the back of the net. And he always points out that I made a point of describing the first goal he scored against Stoke, two very, very different goals, but all of the goals that Hoddle scored for Spurs really were pieces of art. And I think everyone knew that he was going to leave. He was desperate to go and play on the continent. It wasn't that he was underappreciated by Spurs managers, but he never got the recognition he should have got on national level. It was criminal that he only got 53 caps for England. He would have got 153 if he'd been French or Spanish. So he'd always made it very, very clear that he wanted to play on the continent. And the fact that English clubs weren't playing in European football, I think probably accelerated that even further. David Pleat had managed to get an extra year out of him. I think in Hoddle's mind, he was going to go in 86, but we got another season out of him. So yeah, to lose that generational talent, I mean, it would have been similar to Spurs losing Harry Kane a couple of years ago as a more contemporary reference, or, losing Jimmy Greaves when he left Spurs in 1969. So Hoddle going was a huge blow, because how do you get that creativity back into the side? How do you do it? You don't is the answer.
For the 1987-88 season, in addition to Glenn Hoddle, Tottenham also lost the Irish winger Tony Galvin. He joined Sheffield Wednesday. Welsh defender Mark Bowen joined Norwich City. After a few months, the Scottish defender Richard Gough joined Rangers Glasgow. Later in the season, you have Ozzy Ardiles leaving the club. He joined Blackburn Rovers. After a decade, that was the end of him as a player with Tottenham. As far as the arrivals, you have the Dutchman John Metgod arriving from Nottingham Forest, but he would be injured for much of a season and would not make an impact. From Nottingham Forest, you also have Chris Fairclough, a defender. You have Everton backup goalkeeper Bobby Meams arriving in the new year, as well as Terry Fennick from QPR. Of course, Terry Venables' link will come to. And Liverpool striker Paul Walsh also arrived in the new year. This would be a poor season for Tottenham, who would finish 13th. But the significant news would be the resignation of David Pleat. David Pleat would resign in October due to tabloid revelations.
Mhm.
He'll be replaced by Terry Venables, who had just been sacked by Barcelona. It took some time for Terry Venables to make an impact. Was this in all a transition season because of the off-field problems?
I think it was the ultimate transition season. As we've discussed, Hoddle going was really significant. Richard Gough, who come in the previous year and was that rock at the back that Spurs had he lost in Roberts and Miller both leaving the club. Gough to many was an absolute Rolls Royce of a defender, and he had to leave for personal reasons. His wife hadn't settled in London, and insisted for the sake of their marriage that they move back up to Scotland. So he left. As you, Clements had effectively retired in goal. Then Ozzy Ardiles, you were getting the dying embers of his career. He was eventually released, and I think one of the faults of David Pleat was that he'd sold off all the undercards. So you mentioned Mark Bowen. There was a number of other young players. Largely, had all been sold to Norwich, like Ian Crook and was it Culverhouse as well. So there was several players. Now, one of the little gems really that I uncovered through researching the book was just how strong Spurs youth team had been during the 80s. It's the one department that is constantly competent and performing throughout the decade. And there was a number of really good players who start coming into the first team in this 87-88 season, players like Vinnie Samways, David Howells. But because Pleat had sold so many of that next group up who had got first team experience, it meant that they were a little bit exposed, and that gap between the first team players that had been released and those that were young players that were coming in were too great. So yeah, ultimately it was a season of huge transition. No more significant than Terry Venables coming in as manager, which was in itself a bit of a marquee appointment at the time. He really was probably the equivalent of Jose Mourinho maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But Terry Venables was an ex-Spurs player. He played for Spurs in the 60s, and he was a really, really bright, gifted, and very highly regarded coach, to such an extent that having taken QPR from the second division to the first division, he was allured away to manage Barcelona for 3 years and won them their first league title in, I think, 13 years.
In Terry Venables' first full season in charge, the 1988-89 season, you have the departures of John Metcalf, who really did make an impact. He joined Feyenoord. Steve Hodge joins Nottingham Forest. Nico Clayson goes back to the Belgian league to Antwerp. John Chidozie is offloaded to Derby County. Clive Allen joins the French league. He joins Bordeaux. Later in the season, Chris Fairclough would also join Leeds United. As far as the arrivals, Paul Stewart is signed from Man City. The Spanish player Naim, he joins from Barcelona. One of the Terry Venables discoveries at Barcelona. Later, you have the Icelandic defender Gudni Bergson joining the club, as well as the Norwegian goalkeeper Erik Thorsvedt from IFK Göteborg. But the most significant signing in that summer is that of a certain Paul Gascoigne from Newcastle United. So there is some improvement in the team as the team finished sixth. What can you say about this first full season of Venables and his impact?
From a personal level, this is the first season that I started following Spurs as a 7-year-old at the time. So this is where my own personal memories start to kick in writing the book. But as a season, yeah, I mean, you've got the transition of going from Pleat to Venables, and Venables trying to embed these new players, some of which are coming through the youth team, some of which were players that were purchased. And it starts really badly. So on the end of October, Spurs are bottom of the first division. You talk about Berkshire at the start of it, surviving relegation. Almost unheard of now that a Spurs manager would survive having been bottom of the table as late into the season as October. It took a while for not so much for Gascoigne to settle, but for him to form that relationship with Waddle, which as 1989 kicks in, becomes really, really key to the success of Spurs, and you start to see the team growing and developing. So it was a very much a slow burner at the start of that year, but then they start clicking into gear, and you're starting to see the formation of a new team that would go on to win the FA Cup in 1991 under Venables, starting to take shape. I think in Gascoigne's arrival, I think it's really important to point out that Irving Scholar, who had this vision of Spurs being this club that performs with a swagger both on and off the pitch and attracting the best players, Gascoigne was a really precocious talent. Everyone in the country knew about him and knew that his destiny was to become one of the best players in England. And Spurs really had no rights to sign him. That Liverpool and Manchester United were both interested. They'd finished first and second in the league championship the year before that, and Alex Ferguson thought he'd agreed a deal with Gascoigne, but Scholar managed to convince him. And I suppose Venables would have played a part in that as well, in bringing Gascoigne to North London. And at the time, it was a record British transfer signing. It lasted for about a week until Everton signed Tony Cottee. But Spurs were suddenly throwing money around at players. So they bought Gascoigne for $2 million, which was a lot of money in '88. They also bought Paul Stewart for around $2 million, which was also a lot of money. And Spurs were considered to be, Mr. Moneybags. That's were the comments that were made about them, particularly when they started the season so badly, that Spurs, who were this cash-rich club who were throwing money around left, right, and centre, were really struggling in the league. But so they did turn it round, and they did start to build a little bit of momentum, which set them up well for the following season.
So the following season, 1989-90 season, in the summer you have the record departure of Chris Waddle to Olympique Marseille in France. Later in the season, you have Gary Stevens leaving the club, joining Portsmouth. As far as arrivals, you have the Welsh defender Pat Vandenhouwe arriving from Everton, Steve Sedgley arriving from Coventry. But more importantly, Tottenham and Venables pulled off a coup by signing Gary Lineker from Barcelona. Lineker's goals, along with the emerging talents of Gascoigne, would lead to a third place finish for the 1989-90 season. So as the decade ends, was there a feeling that Tottenham were a growing, improving side into the next decade?
Definitely on the pitch, yeah. As you said, they finished third. Whereas in '85 and '87, they'd genuinely been in the talk for league title. There was never that conversation in '89, '90. In fact, they'd started the season again really poorly. They were in the lower half of the table. It took Lineker a while. By his standards, it was a real goal drought. It took him, I think, 7 games for him to score his first Spurs goal. But once he did score, he couldn't stop scoring. And he formed that relationship with Gascoigne, which not only benefited Spurs, but it benefited England as well. And the pair of them, of course, then went to star for England at the World Cup in Italy in 1990. But finishing third feels like a bit of a modest achievement compared to what had gone before in the '80s. But for what we know was to happen during the '90s, Spurs didn't finish third again until 2016. So yeah, it was a really good young Spurs side, but incongruously, what was going on in the boardroom and financially at the time was really starting to take its grip on Spurs, and ultimately that was what prevented them from going on and developing that side even further into a genuine title-winning side.
Looking ahead to the 90s, it was a decade of instability. Were the 80s in comparisons much calmer as there was a clear contrast between Irving Scholar and Alan Sugar?
It's yeah, it's a really interesting question, Sean, because from what's known to us as supporters and looking at purely as things on the pitch, which the majority of our conversation has been, yeah, you've got this build up and you think, well, the momentum's going to take this Spurs side further. But behind the scenes, the fact that Spurs had set up as a PLC in theory was a good idea. The whole theory behind it was that you'd have all these subsidiary companies, and what the club or what the PLC had been doing was buying all these different companies. So it bought a women's clothing company, it bought a cricket equipment company. It bought a digital ticketing systems company, which was going to supposedly make millions because this company was going to get the contract to issue the tickets for the World Cup in 1990. It was also going to be a company that was going to print these identity cards that the government was insisting all football supporters needed to have. Spurs also bought Hummel, which was the kit company. So Hummel features within the subtitle of the book. And the reason for that is Hummel was the Danish manufacturing company that Irving Scholar not only got a deal from to produce Spurs kits, but then took over their UK distribution. So the idea was you had all these companies that were going to make money and that was going to be invested into the team, which is a sound proposition until for one reason or another, all these companies actually stopped making money and actually drained money out of the football club. So by the time of 89-90, Spurs are going out and lavishly spending money on players like Gascoigne and Lineker, but they're starting to rack up the debts and they're now in quite a significant overdraft facility, which culminates in them realising a debt of about £11 million in 1991 when Scholar very reluctantly ends up selling the club and Alan Sugar takes it over, which then starts up what's happening in the 90s. So from a financial perspective, Irving Scholar left the club in an absolute mess. They were genuinely in an existential crisis where they could have gone bankrupt or they could have fallen into some very, very unsavoury hands. So Alan Sugar takes over the club and provides that financial footing for the club, which comes at the expense of being able to build a team and constantly investing in high quality players that Spurs ultimately had done during the 80s.
If not for the Heysel ban, would Tottenham have improved in the league and or continue to perform in Europe?
Yeah, I think so. I think they both would have continued that run of being in European football every season at the highest level and would have continued to attract the best players. But yeah, there's a number of external factors which Irving Scholar and Spurs had no control of, which ultimately led to their downfall. One of which was that Heysel ban. You've also got there was another tragedy in 1985, which was the fire at Bradford City when 36 fans lost their lives that day, which totally changed health and safety requirements. Football club, and this is one of the themes that I explored in the book, that all football stadiums up and down the country were dilapidated. They were often largely unchanged from when they were built in the early 20th century. They were literally falling apart in some cases. So that meant that Spurs wanting to spend lavishly on players and the PLC draining money from the club, they actually had to then go and reinvest in rebuilding the East End, which was the shelf side, the iconic side of the stadium. You then had the stock market crash in London in 1987, which Spurs as a PLC are particularly really felt the effects of that. You've got the growing concerns around hooliganism and safety, which meant that supporters weren't coming to games, which was the leading source of revenue for clubs. So Spurs were kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, unfortunately. And that does have a big effect on their ambitions and what ultimately they could achieve.
Just like on our 90s discussion, we have to discuss the kits. And as your title suggests, in the tail end of the decade, there are the Hummel Holston kits. But equally, there are the Lecoq Sportive kits of the beginning of the decade who are just as impressive, including the yellow away kits of Lecoq Sportive. What stands out for you?
So I think for me, the first Spurs kit I can remember Spurs playing in is the one that features on the front cover of the book, which is that Holston sponsored kit with the chevrons on it. Yeah, you're showing it up there. That was the first Spurs shirt that I ever had. I've got it as a retro one now. But that Hummel kit, I really really like that one. I think lots of people talk really affectionately about the pure simplicity of Le Coq Sportive kit that Spurs wore in 1981 with the shine on it and the shine on the shorts of that picture in the top corner of Chris Hughton. That's from a couple of years later, but it's fundamentally the same design. Yeah, you had Spurs playing in yellow. They won the FA Cup in 1982, playing in their change yellow kit. So yeah, lots of really, really iconic kits at that time.
Were the main highlights in the beginning of the decade with the double FA Cup triumph and the 1984 UEFA Cup. So, how do Tottenham historians view the early part of the decade?
I think for many Spurs fans who I've spoken to who weren't around for the 60s, the 80s is that golden period for Spurs, where they went to Wembley, was it 7 times in 15 months between finals, replays, charity shields. It's an iconic team. All of those players that I named from the 81 cup winning team individually are club legends, but collectively they are as well. It's a period that so many Spurs fans are really affectionate about, and probably those Spurs fans who remember the 80s, which I don't firsthand, it maybe sets the scene for why the 90s is seen as such an eye roll decade and such an underwhelming one because of those memories of the 80s. But yeah, I think if Spurs had got that league title over the line in 85, it would have put the 80s on the same pedestal as the 60s.
Is Keith Birkinshaw the last great Tottenham manager due to his unexpected successes?
Yeah, I guess he had the combination of fielding an iconic side that largely played in the style of play that Spurs fans see Spurs as being synonymous with. He created an environment where you could get Hoddle, Ardiles, and Villa in the same side with goal scorers. He's got those trophies to his name, including European Cup as well. I think the fact that he left on a high is really important for his legacy. I mean, not to say that Spurs wouldn't have gone on and perhaps even done even better had he stayed there for a few years after that, but the fact that he can leave with his last game being that UEFA Cup win, I think means that he'll always be remembered really, really affectionately.
In closing, what is the lasting legacy of this Tottenham decade in the 1980s in English football history?
Okay, so I think Spurs end the decade as one of the big five. So the big five: Arsenal, Liverpool, Everton, Manchester United, and Tottenham. So Spurs during the 80s, and again, Scholar was important in doing this, established Spurs on that top table of English football. They were still signing exciting players. I think that you throughout the 80s, whether they're winning trophies at the start of it or whether they're not winning trophies at the back end of it, but they're playing entertaining football with the likes of Gascoigne, Waddle, and Lineker. You've got some really iconic Spurs teams and players. Very much the legacy that Irving Scholar leaves for English football is what the Premier League becomes, and this having this global reach and English football being recognised around the world. But ultimately, the legacy that Spurs leave the 80s with is the crippling financial situation that they're in, some of which was unavoidable and quite unfortunate, but some of it is well intentioned but self enforced. And that sets the scene for Spurs, certainly during the 90s and then again going into the 2000s as well.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Dace's book. Here it is again: Hot Shot Tottenham, Spurs in the 80s, Huddle, Hummel, and Hazards. These links are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Gareth, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
It's been a pleasure coming back on. Thank you so much for your interest and for reading through the book. And if I can just give a plug to my new podcast as well. I've now started a podcast to promote both of my Spurs books. So you very kindly interviewed me to talk about Is Gascoigne going to have a crack, which is the Spurs in the 90s story. So the podcast I've got, which has just launched this week, is mostly about the 90s or the early part of the 90s. It does cover a bit of the back end of the 80s. It's also called Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? It'll be available on all your podcast platform. So if this period in Tottenham's history is of interest to you, then yeah, please have a listen to the podcast as well.
So, thanks again. Hopefully, we'll catch up again when you write another book.
Thank you very much, Sean. It's a real pleasure and well done for keeping this podcast so interesting and such an eclectic mix of authors talking about such a wide range of football topics. I'm really impressed when I have them drop into my inbox every week.
Thank you. Appreciate it.